What's happening, guys? This is a little bit of an impromptu episode, but it is the fifth installment of the current web series here on the One Bad Apple channel. I wasn't planning on doing an episode today, but I've listened to this album twice just this morning and countless times in my lifetime, and it continually blows my mind. It's much older than the material I would typically cover, but the obvious influence these guys have had not only on their peers in the 60s, but on modern music deserves to be explored. Not that I'll be the first to give these guys their props. They were inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in 2019, and I'll cover a handful of the many bands they've influenced here in a minute. The album is Odessey and Oracle by the Zombies. This album came out in 1967 and has a bit of a psychedelic vibe, but also has a very pronounced classical thread that runs through it. I'm certainly no expert on classical music, but I believe this would be most similar to music from the Baroque period. I only say this because many of the piano and keyboard lines remind me of something that might have been played on a harpsichord. Essentially what I'm saying is these guys took bits and pieces from a style that was already 300 years old and turned it into rock and roll gold. To me, the only thing that's particularly psychedelic is the album cover. If you're looking for a modern reference, and I'm talking only about this album specifically, I would say there's a similarity in mood and song structure to a band like Belle and Sebastian. If you're not familiar with them either, I highly recommend checking them out. When I was first introduced to this album, I immediately thought these guys were influenced by the Beach Boys, but it turns out the Beach Boys as well as the Beatles were influenced by them. At one point, John Lennon even offered to be their manager. But let's take a look at what was happening around this time. The Beatles came out with Sgt. Pepper's, the Zombies had this release, and Cream came out with Disraeli Gears all within 6 months of each other. Iron Butterfly would release In-A-Gadda-Da-Vida the next year, so the psychedelic bit was in full force. These all came at the tail end of the British invasion, and the Beatles, Cream, and the Zombies would all be broken up by 1970. This was only the Zombies' second album, but would also be their last. Surprisingly, being a masterpiece, this album did not sell well. To me, it's always disappointing when albums like this fly under the radar, but ultimately they ended up having several songs that have become staples on classic rock radio, so these guys eventually were able to make some money on their art. So this turned into kind of more of a history lesson than a direct discussion of the album, but that's okay. I mean, we play it real loose here. I hear something new every time I listen to this album, and I can't recommend it enough. I really couldn't narrow down 10 seconds from this album, and the clip I'm going to share is not necessarily my favorite, but it's arguably the most popular song from this album, and I think you might recognize it when you hear it. So since I'll probably get hit with a copyright claim anyway, let's give you 30 seconds of meditation, and I'll see you on the next one.
What's your name?
What's your name?
Who's your daddy?
Who's your daddy?